molecule I know a little bit about, which is hexahydrocannabinol, right? Hexahydrocannabinol is what you get when you hydrogenate THC. So when you add a molecule of hydrogen to THC, you convert tetrahydrocannabinol into hexahydrocannabinol. And this was an article that was published by a Czechoslovakian group last week. And it is out of the journal Nature, which, for those of you who don't know, is one of the top-tier scientific journals in the world. So when stuff gets published in Nature, it's truly important and often is very at the current frontier of where the science frontier exists. So the title of the article is Hexahydrocannabinol and Delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol driven activation of the CB1 receptor results in biased intracellular signaling. And so what this group did is they looked at how HHC impacts neuronal cell signaling in an area that I'm very interested in, which is that do these things act at the CB1 receptor? And if they act at the CB1 receptor, do they behave like other compounds that we know act at the CB1 receptor? So cannabis sativa plant has been used for centuries as a recreational drug and more recently in treatment of patients with neurological or psychiatric disorders. In many instances, treatment goals include relief of post-traumatic disorders, anxiety, and to support treatment of chronic pain. Ligands, that's the compounds, often called ligands. A compound becomes a ligand as soon as it binds to a receptor. So when you hear the term ligand, spelled Ligands, that means it's a compound that's acting on a receptor in the body. So ligands acting on cannabinoid receptor 1 are also potent targets for this treatment and other health conditions. Using an evidence-based approach, pharmacological investigation of CB1 agonists is timely. So an agonist is something that binds to the receptor and then turns the receptor on. An antagonist is something that binds to the receptor and turns the receptor off. So they're looking at other CB1 agonists. So THC Delta-9 is a CB1 agonist, and also the WIN compound, which I've actually have drawn on the board. WIN stands for Sterling Winthrop, which used to be a pharmaceutical company that was making cannabinoid compounds. They've since gone out of business. WIN 55212-2 is kind of the gold standard for synthetic cannabinoids. You'll see that this compound resembles THC in the least bit. It doesn't look like a phytocannabinoid at all, but it still has the right molecular spinach to basically bind to the receptor and act as an agonist. So hexahydrocannabinol, or HHC, currently available in many over-the-counter countries to adults and even children, is of great interest to policymakers, legal administrators, and healthcare regulators, as well as pharmacologists. Herein, we studied the pharmacodynamics of HHC epimers. Okay, so what is an epimer? So when you hydrogenate THC and you make HHC, you make two epimers. You make the R and you make the S epimer. And that's because the hydrogenation can happen from the top of the molecule, giving you the S isomer, or the bottom of the molecule, which is going to push the methyl up, giving you the R isomer. So typically in HHC today, it's a mixture of both R and S isomers that are in there. So those are called epimers. We compared their CB1 mediated signaling pathways activities and compared them to pathways activated by Delta-9 and also the WIN compound, which I have drawn on the board. We provide evidence that activation of CB1 be won by HHC lineage, which is only broadly comparable to those mediated by Δ9-THC, and both HHC epimers have unique properties. Together with a greater chemical stability of HHC compared to Δ9-THC, these molecules have potentials to be part of modern medicine. Okay, so what they did is they looked at HHC in a couple different assays, and I'll talk about the assays and talk about how they're relevant. So what they were looking at was something called BRET, and BRET is a acronym BRET, which is bioluminescence resonance energy transfer. And so when you actually get the binding of these molecules to the receptor, it actually is coupled then to a light reaction. So basically they can measure the intensity of the light, which basically tells them about the intensity of the binding. And so in a couple different assays, what they were able to look at was not only the binding of the synthetic HHC epimers, but they were also able to look at G protein activation induced by the CB1 binding. And so what they find is that it's not as potent as the Win compound and not as potent as THC. But apparently it looks as though that the R HHC isomer is a little bit more active than the S. And we know that from some work that Meshulam had published back in 1971, where he looked at HHC, the HHC epimers. He separated them too and looked at them in both dog and monkey preclinical tests, and found that the R was more active than the S. So the other thing that's very interesting here is that it looks like, and when you compare the overall activity, that these things might be hitting a different target because they are upregulating kinases. Kinases are enzymes that initiate phosphorylation of proteins. And so this is a hallmark signal of cannabinoids' biological activity. So we see same type of upregulation in this phosphorylation. However, these things are weaker binders when they look at how it binds to CB1. So it's likely that these things are inducing this upregulation and phosphorylation by hitting a different target other than CB1. So CB1 is the principal receptor in the central nervous system, in the endocannabinoid system. It's expressed in all regions of the brain, including those that are very important for processing anxiety, fear, stress, and cognitive functions. So, what we hear is that from people who consume HHC is that they do still feel a headiness, kind of like a stoniness, the same thing that you'd feel with Δ9, but it's lower, it's less. It's not as heady. If you take a hero-sized dab of the stuff, it will put you on your ass, and certainly you can just overwhelm that with dose. But in general, these things are less active at CB1. So this paper basically is just proving it. It's also looking at other things that have been implicated in how cannabinoids work in the body. There's several pathways where they activate things called G proteins and G protein mediated signaling of the beta arrestin pathway, which are all very, very important biochemical processes that cannabinoids act on. So it's very interesting because I know that the Czech Republic had taken a very strong stance on these alternative cannabinoids. I know that there's quite a bit of this hydrogenation going on over in Europe, and there is quite a concern in the European Union about consuming HHC. But I think the take home from this paper here is that HHC is probably not toxic. It's no more toxic than Δ9-THC would be, and it elicits some of the same type of reactions, but maybe at a lower potency. So, that's basically the paper. There's a couple other papers on HHC that have been recently published too, and there's no real bad effects that we see from it. So it seems like it's safe for humans, but just less potent. So again, that's my story today. Monday, be interested in what you guys have to say about it. But that's the story about HHCA from the Czech Republic. Here's Dr. Mark up in the state of Vermont. Interested in what you guys have to say about it.
Man, I mean, it's as strong as weed, but it's not as strong as weed, Dr. Mark? And is that what we're understanding?
No, it's not as strong. So side by side with THC is a little more potent. And you can see this in their data, in this activation of phosphorylation, in the binding to CB1. But when you make HHC, you make a mixture of R and S, and what we know is that the R isomer is more active than the S isomer. So if you're consuming an HHC product that's a mixture of R and S, yeah, it's going to be less active than THC, because the S isomer is a lot weaker of a binder to CB1. So it's not as active, Jason. But is there a market for cannabinoids that don't get you high? Obviously for medical effects, or for certainly the medicinal aspects of cannabinoids can still be there without the high that's associated with CB1 agonism.
You have any thoughts on this, Yarrow?
I think this is pretty heady stuff.
Yeah,
all pun intended. It's deep dive into science. It's a little abstract. He's probably reading from an abstract. A lot of this goes over my head and not into my lungs because I'm not a scientist. So I appreciate Mark for bringing information that I may not have a real-time ability to reconcile with the modest little things that I do in this space. I think it's important that there are people like him who continue to advance the conversations around the scientific and medicinal properties of cannabis, and also act to amplify that information for those where it's relevant. And so I can only default to what I've said many times, including earlier on this show today, which is my hope in the future is that cannabinoids are regulated according to intoxicating versus non-intoxicating, and not according to which plant they come from. And there's still a lot of work to be done on the scientific research side. We all know that.
Well, I think the bottom line is, people asked, years ago or a couple of years ago, is HHC and, my compound, which is HHCA, are these safe to consume? And until this data came out, we just didn't know. We know anecdotally when people consume it that, yeah, they don't feel as high as they do when they take THC. Well, here's the data that explains why HHC is less potent than Δ9. So I think that's good. But I think that, I'll go back to what I've always said, Jason, which is that if we end cannabis prohibition, if people have access to high quality cannabis and cannabis products, we won't need HHC. HHC might serve some purpose down the road in a medicinal application, but we need to do all kinds of testing to really, understand, what does HHC do that THC Δ9 doesn't do?
Yeah,
exactly. It's just less potent.
Exactly.
Well,
what's the need for it to exist?
What if you just took a smaller hit of your Δ9? Would you get to the same place that a larger hit of HHC would bring you? So I think.